Ladies and gentlemen, I think our distinguished guest, first welcome you to this special evening. It is with no communication together. It has been, I would like to give you this welcome on behalf of the Kuwaiti British Friendship Society, which has been awarding this annual prize, the best scholar in 1998. This is extremely valuable culture project, would not have been possible without the support of Sheikh Abdullah Mubarak Sabah Foundation. It was a good idea, an idea from Sheikh Suad Al Sabah. Allow me to take this opportunity to thank you for your generosity sponsoring this prestigious event and their commitment to promotion Middle Eastern study in a British university through various scholarship schemes. I would like also to extend my thanks, who is not here, but for Sheikh Mubarak Abdullah Al Sabah for his generosity, which benefited many students for many years. His commitment and his tireless efforts made this important event continue since it was founded in 1996 with His Royal Highness Prince Charles and Dr. Suad Al Sabah are amongst its honorary presidents and to whom we are ever so grateful. Many thanks are also owed to the organizing committee, and I can see them, the organizing committee, and the judges for deciding on the winning books. At the same time, allow me to congratulate the winner of the valuable prize. Your hard work has paid off. Today, we hope that you will all feel encouraged and inspired to write and contribute further to this cultural treasure. Distinguished guests, the book prize is another demonstration of how highly cultures and arts are valued in Kuwait. Under the guidance of His Highness the Amir, Sheikh Nawaf Al-Ahmed Jabir Sabah, Kuwait is keen to exert every effort to promote and protecting culture, arts, literature, especially our Islamic culture.
Sheikh Mubarak, and I want.
He's here.
More.
Louise, you're on. Can you mute, please?
Wait, I will continue my speech, and I hope Sheikh Mubarak will be here. Kuwait continues to exert efforts to spreading culture awareness and enlightened intellection, as well as strengthening the cultural role and protecting the world cultural heritage at home and abroad. Kuwait is keen to developing various creative and cultural industries for today's generation, and it is intended to be bequeathed to to future generations. As the ambassador of Kuwait to the United Kingdom for a long time, I pay tribute to the strong and prosperous relation between our two countries. Our two countries, Sheikh Mubarak, we talk about your organization and but you were a little bit late and this Zoom is terrible. In fact, Kuwait and the UK have had a great celebrated 3 years ago or 4 years ago. We celebrated 120 years agreement between Kuwait Sheikh Mubarak at that time, and Queen Victoria in 1899. Well, anniversary of that time, 120 anniversary, signing the British Kuwait Agreement of 1899. As I said, the treaty highlighted the founding of great relationship between the two countries. These distinguished relations continue to grow year after year, and we are committed to all we can so these relations are strong and prosperous even after 2000 years, inshallah. I wish those in charge of Abdullah Mubarak's Foundation every success and continuation of the positive role they play in promoting Arab-British relations, particularly in the cultural and scientific field, as the foundation is doing these days. Thank you. Thank you again, distinguished guests, for being here tonight. And I hope you have a wonderful evening despite the Zoom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Walid. Actually, I was with you from the beginning, but I had a problem with the video. I do apologize, and thank you for your kind words. It's lovely to see you after so many years, and also many friends around Ambassador Francis, and also our prize winners, and Luis, of course, and whoever is unable to attend. We wish them all the best, and we salute them for their efforts and thank them always immensely. I would have loved to be with you in person, but for a variety of reasons, for last minute we decided to continue with our virtual prize giving. But I hope from next year, inshallah, or if not before, we'll keep in touch. Thank you.
I hope so. I hope so.
Is it my turn now? I'm not sure, how these things go.
I think Louise is going to give a few housekeeping instructions,
Sure.
and then I'm going to start at the
Very
beginning,
bad
and
with
then I'm
these
going to
Zoom
pass
calls.
to you, Sheikh Mubarak, if I may. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Ambassador, are you going, Mrs. Guy? Are you going to speak or Sheikh
Louise is
Mubarak?
going to speak first.
Yeah,
Thank
no.
you.
Louise,
Yeah, sorry. First, I'm going to shortly hand over to Francis, but I'd just like to explain that now you've given your open introduction, Francis is going to give a very quick run through about the prize, an overview of the prize, but then she's going to focus on the shortlisted titles because we did have some incredibly good books submitted this year. Then once she's done the run through about the prize, she's going to hand over to Sheikh Mubarak because Sheikh Mubarak has very kindly agreed to introduce our two winning authors. And we're going to then move to a conversation with each of the winning authors. We'll start off with Marina Rusto, who is going to talk to Marie Legendre, and they're going to discuss her book for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll move on to Zaina Masri, who's going to talk with Daniel Lowe about her book. There is a Q&A button, which is what I want to come to now, which is at the bottom of your screens. If any of you have any questions, and I'm sure you will have for the two winning authors, please do pop them into the Q&A and we'll do our very best to make sure that they're all covered. We're hoping to sort of wind up the event round about sort of 7:15. So we will be brief. I'll be brief. I've now finished, and it's my great pleasure to hand over to Francis.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you, Sheikh Mubarak, for joining us this evening. And thank you both for your long support to the prize. Without the kind hospitality of the ambassador for many years, we would not have had so many joyous occasions, and hopefully we will have another joyous occasion in person. And obviously without the continuous financial and personal support of Sheikh Mubarak, the prize would not exist. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the panel of judges. And I'm pleased to see that most of the judges are with us tonight. And so I just wanted to let you know who are on the panel of judges. So the panel of judges consists of Sheikh Mubarak Al-Abdallah Al-Mubarak Al-Sabah, Professor Carol Hillenbrand, Professor Emerita at the University of Edinburgh, Professor Yasser Suleiman, until recently Sultan Qaboos bin Said, Professor of Modern Arabic Studies at Cambridge University, Sir Roger Tomkis, former Master of Pembroke College, Cambridge, and Professor Charles Tripp, former Professor of Politics with reference to the Middle East at the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London. I'd like to thank all of the judges for their commitment and time, but offer a special thanks to Sir Roger Tomkis, who was one of the original instigators of the prize and who has been on the panel of judges ever since. And
Where is the ambassador?
Sorry?
Where is Roger Tomkins?
They're here. It's just we're on a panel and they're watching. So
They're
he is
watching.
here,
I
Ambassador.
called ambassador.
We can promote him so you can see him, but he's probably happy to be sitting in the background
Oh,
somewhere.
okay.
But I can assure you he's here. I can see him. Thank you. And I also, as well as Roger, I'd also like to thank Louise, because without Louise's hard work behind the scenes, the prize would also not happen. So thank you, Louise. And thank you for thanking her. So the prize is a celebration of scholarly work on the Middle East in the widest sense, in that we include works on Turkey and Iran and Islamic studies. And I'd just like to also remind you of the criteria we use for selecting the prize winners. So these are originality, clarity and accessibility, and importance to the field. And we try to assess how well the book enhances the understanding of the subject matter to a wider audience. So basically that accessibility piece. In other words, can a non-academic read this book and enjoy it? And as the non-academic on the panel, I consider that to be my task. I would say that this year, nearly all the books were very, very accessible and very, very readable. I mean, all of those that were submitted. We have submissions from a wide range of subjects: language, literature, sociology, anthropology, history, Islamic art, archaeology. It's great fun trying to read them all, honestly. But as well as all of this, we also have a system of anonymous reviewers. So although the judges do our best, and in COVID, I think we've certainly have read all of the books quite thoroughly, the reviewers do help us by providing an anonymous review of each of the books, and they're experts in the field. So I'd like to also publicly thank them for all their help. So this year we announced a shortlist of 6 books, and it's a good example of the wide range of books that are submitted. And I'd encourage everybody here to take a look at them. And I'd like to share with you some of the comments from the reviewers about those books. And then I'll hand over to Sheikh Mubarak to name the winners, so we know. Our shortlist included Rediscovering the Islamic Classics: How Editors and Print Culture Transformed an Intellectual Tradition by Ahmed Al-Shamsi, published by Princeton University Press. And our reviewer commented, Al-Shamsi succeeds in taking a very fresh perspective. It is particularly pleasant that the book puts so much emphasis on indigenous actors and avoids any remaining notion of framing the changes in this period in a simplistic modernization or learning from Europe model. There is no doubt that this book is a product of sustained research and that it fulfills an important function in suggesting new avenues to rethink the 19th century. So, congratulations. Also shortlisted was Libya's Fragmentation, Structure and Process in Violent Conflict by Wolfram Lacher, published by IB Tauris. And the quality of this work was summarized by the reviewer's comments, who said the book provides a masterful blow-by-blow account of the breakdown of Libya's transitional process, the outbreak of a second bout of civil war in 2014, and the current governance crisis. The narrative of the book is unerringly clear. The processes are highly complex and atomized, but that will come as no surprise to the scholar of Libyan politics, for whom this is simply a must-read. And as someone with a good friend in the special representative to the UN office for Libya, I am going to make sure that they also read this book because there's a bit of a dearth of such scholarship. Also shortlisted was Imperial Mecca, Ottoman Arabia and the Indian Ocean Hajj by Michael Christopher Lowe, published by Columbia University Press. And the reviewer noted that this is a marvelous book, obviously many years in the making, on a subject that might seem of merely peripheral significance to many, but which the scope and depth of the author's research and the sheer power and buoyancy of his writing propels it into a page turner and makes its subject matter not just multifaceted, but many splendid. The reviewer also noted that they opened the book with no preconceptions and were bowled over by its range, its authority, its profound and creative scholarship, its sheer human interest and its engaging style. So just to complete this big circle, we also had shortlisted a book called Afghan Village Voices, Stories from a Tribal Community, which was edited by Richard Tapper with Nancy Lindisfarne Tapper, also published by IB Tauris. And from the title, you can tell that it's a collection of stories. And the reviewer said that the interviews transport the reader into a world that has more or less disappeared after some 40 years of conflict and migration. In many respects, this is a classic old school ethnography, but it is definitely not dry or esoteric account of a far off world. The interviews compellingly capture the Afghan storytelling tradition, and the voices of the narrators ring through on every page. So given this very high standard, you can appreciate that our two joint winners here with us tonight impressed the judges very greatly. And I'm very pleased to hand over to Sheikh Mubarak to formally announce the two winners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Francis. Most obliged. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, distinguished guests, it's a great pleasure to participate in this award ceremony on behalf of the Abdullah Mubarak Foundation, which has supported the prize since its inception in 1998. Although we are not able to meet in person, we hope very much to have an in-person event next year, and have been generously told and offered by the Lord Mayor of the City of London that he would be happy to host us in 2022 at the Mansion House. I'm therefore hopeful that I will meet many of you, friends, scholars, particularly the winners and authors, in person next year. In the meantime, I'm delighted that the winning authors are able to join us to give us the opportunity to hear about their work this evening. It is with great pleasure that I announce the two joint winners. The Lost Archive, Traces of a Caliphate in a Cairo Synagogue by Marina Rustow, Princeton University Press, and Cosmopolitan Radicalism, The Visual Politics of Beirut's Global 60s by Dr. Zeina Maasri, Cambridge University Press. So congratulate both winners, Professor Rustow and Dr. Maasri, on their wonderful achievement and works, scholarly contribution. Before handing over the winners, I would like to share some of our comments, or of the comments of our reviewers. On The Lost Archive, our reviewer commented, "This is a book unparalleled in Islamic studies and the field of medieval history as a whole. It sets the standard on how history should be written. The range of sources, primary and secondary, employed in The Lost Archive is spectacular. The methodology is unparalleled. The contribution this book makes to the field are countless. It will remain a must-read for the decades to come for anyone interested in the history of pre-modern states and empire, scribes and scribal practice, the history of the discipline, decolonizing the field, the introduction of new technology, i.e. paper making, to name only a few." Not only is this book well written, it is fascinating in the true sense of the word. I could hardly put it down. On cosmopolitan radicalism, our reviewer noted, Zeina Maasri's book is unique in terms of its originality and scope. She provides a counterpoint to Western-centric histories and theories of design and visual culture, and adds to growing scholarship examining the process of decolonization in the region. Quote, for the field of Middle East studies, many new ideas and theories related to design, aesthetics, and cultural production are introduced in a clear and well-referred way. Moreover, the reproduction of source material as illustrations and plates in the book serve as useful visual tools and reference points for the reader, especially in the absence of holdings of much of their material in institutional libraries and archives. And they make the book very visually appealing. I hope all of you joining us tonight will have a chance to read these excellent books. Now it is my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Marie Legendre of Edinburgh University, who will open the discussion with Professor Rustow and her book, before in turn handing over to Mr. Daniel Rowe from the British Library to open a discussion with Dr. Zeina Maasri. Last but of course not least, my thanks goes to our friends and fellow judges of the panel. Of course, our Dr. Francis, who is chairing the judges panel, but we cannot go without, raising our hats to Professor Roger Tompkins, who I don't see here today, but I make sure I call him and say hello, because it's been a while. I haven't been to the UK, who has, of course, been the spearhead of this project from inception, and also our fellow judges who have been with us also for many years, Professor Carl Hillebrand from Edinburgh University, and Professor Charles Tripp, and our friend also, Professor Silliman, who also chaired the Judges Committee for many years, who I also look forward to connecting with in the near future. I thank them for their, real attention to the book prize and to the number of books and publishers who have been presented towards this prestigious prize. I think the numbers this year have at least 40 or 50, am I correct, Professor Francis, Dr. Ambassador Francis? The participants, at least.
I'm happy to be a professor, a doctor, whatever you like. But yeah, we have about 50.
I'm neither of, so it's fine.
I hope, Francis, I hope we'll see your book on the list on Yemen.
So I think, Your Excellency, I think we're very proud to have at least 40 to 50 of the major books on this on the Middle East now every year as part of the prize. Major publishing houses, not only in the UK but also across the Atlantic, from leading universities. And this cannot also happen, Your Excellency, without your support since the inception and your dedication with us every year. Honestly, and your moral support, physical support, and without that we cannot succeed. And we wish you always all the best. And thank you from the bottom of our hearts on behalf of myself, Abdullah Mubarak Foundation, Dr. Saad, and of course the family for everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheikh Mubarak. And I think your generosity and your interest in this. I'm joking, I was joking when I talked to Francis. Guy, because Francis lived in Yemen as an ambassador there, and she did, when I talked to her, she had a lot of idea about what's going on in Yemen. Mm-hmm. So I think your foundation made a really progress and fame for our situation, and a British Kuwaiti Friendship Society will be really proud of these things. Thank you again, Sheikh.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis, again.
Thank you. So over to you, Professor Legendre. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Mubarak. Thank you very much to all. I am very, very fortunate to be in this place today and to ask Marina a few questions about her book. I trust you can hear me well.
Yes, loud and clear from my side. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. So maybe first, if you allow me, I'll just make a point about the reception of the book, The Lost Archive, in the field of Islamic studies. In the few first pages of the book, we find this wonderful sentence. What would the history of the medieval Middle East look like if historians took documents seriously? And when I read this as the aim of the book, I could almost hear the sound of relief across a whole community of scholars. Indeed, specialists of the field have been very quick in writing raving reviews of this book, including one that says, and I quote, "This is not a critical review, right? Rather, it is an unapologetic and unashamed panegyric for arguably the greatest living Geniza historian, and a celebration of her magnum opus, a book that is an absolute joy to read," end of quote. So this is a kind of enthusiasm that has been visible following the publication of The Lost Archive. And this is something I can definitely confirm through the discussion I've had with many colleagues and students about the book. So congratulations, Marina, on both the publication of the book and the prize. And without further ado, I will start with the questions. One important thing in the book is that you have been very honest about the research process that led you to the writing of this book. In the text itself, you are honest about the realizations in the book, but also with the dead ends you have met. And I want to start the discussion by asking, when did you realize that this is the book you were going to write? Was it a progressive thing? Or was there a shift in the field of Geniza studies or something in the discussions you had with your students, for instance? In other words, were there a haha moments in which you realized that's the book I'm going to write?
This is something I love to talk about is process, because I don't think it gets enough attention once the final product is out there. It was a very slow realization. For many reasons. One is that I became interested in the Arabic script documents from the Cairo Geniza. Most of the documents are in Hebrew script, and that's what I had been trained to look at. But I became interested in the Arabic script documents in 2007. And this book didn't really take shape in my mind until 2012. And even then I thought I was writing a totally different book. I thought I was writing a book about the petition and response process under the Fatimid caliphs. And I'm still very interested in petitioning and what it means in terms of theories of rights in the pre-modern world, because there were theories of rights. But I found that I couldn't just dive into the topic. I wanted to understand, because original petitions have survived, are they the only Fatimid documents, original Fatimid documents that have survived, or are there others? So that's when I began digging. And in fact, the book that became The Lost Archive was meant to be the introduction to the book on petitions. And it was only when I reached, I think, like 400 pages of writing that I realized this is not an introduction anymore. I'm going to have to rethink. So at that point, I split it into two, and that's what The Lost Archive was. So in some ways, it's like, you know, it's an introduction. And I think that that's also why I was able to think about writing a more accessible book, because I was trying to kind of introduce a topic rather than diving in medias res.
I guess everyone here is also very interested in the documents you study in this book, which is not only what the book is about, but as you mentioned, some of them, that's going to be the topic of my next question. So the Geniza documents, you show well in the book how exciting it is to work with them, but you also show how challenging it is to work with those documents. So can you tell us a bit more about that? When you were working on the book, what was a typical day or typical months? Because I guess you can't do or you can only do so much in a day. So what was a typical day or month of working with the Geniza documents?
So I was very, very fortunate that while I was beginning the research process, more and more documents were being digitized and being put on the web. And that meant that I could do my research from anywhere, as opposed to having to get on a lot of airplanes, because Geniza collections are in many different countries, more than 60 different libraries and private collections. And had I had to do this research in person, I don't know that the book would have been written. Also, my daughter was born in 2010, and that meant that I could, be with a young child and also have the laptop, and with the other hand, press next, next, next on the images that I wanted to look at. So it was very nice practically from that perspective, but also the accessibility of images has meant, not just for my work, but I think for the whole field, that we're paying much more attention to the physical features of documents. So the script, not just how to read it, but also the meaning of the script. What does it mean that people wrote in particular kinds of scripts for documents, like very calligraphic scripts for decrees that were developed, in fact, by government secretaries in the Abbasid capitals in the 10th century, and then ultimately spread to the rest of the Islamic world. So that was one thing. But the calligraphy and the accessibility of the images doesn't mean that they're easy to read. So there was a lot of frustration that went into trying to make sense of the material, partly because it's fragmentary, and also partly because the Arabic is undotted. So there is a certain amount of ambiguity, and you have to kind of learn the styles and the formulae. And I would say that it took me a good 9 years until I felt confident that I was reading things, if not accurately, then at least like respectably. And it wasn't until I sort of had my shuyukh, I had the people that I would go to for help when I couldn't read something. And after about 9 years, I noticed that if I couldn't read it, they couldn't read it either. And at that point I said, okay, I think I might be ready to publish now.
And that's also what's wonderful about the book, is that you have so many things on the details of working with the documents, but you put that into a very complete inquiry on how those documents were used by the Fatimid state. And you also drew to very large conclusions that have been key topics in the field. And in the book, you achieve no less than settling a centuries-long debate on the question of Middle Eastern archives. So to phrase this in very simplistic terms, the cliche was that there were no archives in the medieval Middle East, like the one that you could find in the medieval West. So first, can you explain to the audience that's virtually present today why this assumption is inaccurate? And second, does your work inform how conclusions about archives in other fields than medieval history or of other fields of medieval history should be studied, for instance, those of the medieval West?
Louis.
Yes, this is a very interesting set of questions. Basically what I was trying to grapple with was a kind of Orientalist myth that in the medieval Middle East, documents weren't important, because all of the important things that happened either happened orally and not in writing, or else because what was really important was the intellectual culture, rather than cultures of archiving and documentation, which is a very different kind of thing. Documents are everyday, they're mirrors of everyday life. And the intellectual culture had really gotten most of the attention of historians. But I'm a social historian, and that means that I also like to study people who are not represented in biographical dictionaries and legal handbooks and chronicles. Especially the chronicles had been some of the major sources. The medieval chronicles are wonderful sources to work with because they're narratively fascinating, and they're great anecdotes, and they're very readable. But they also give you a kind of tiny slice of the society. usually centered on the capitals. And then there's a question of, are these accounts accurate, or are they giving you a kind of biased view? The effects on the field of focusing on these long form sources have been, I think, both positive and negative. Positive in the sense that the whole field of pre-modern Middle Eastern studies has an enormous respect for the intellectual traditions of the Middle East. And the idea is that you can't be a serious historian, let alone, you know, in any other field of Middle Eastern studies, without understanding the place of philosophy, of usul al-fiqh, of all the field of science, of astronomy, of all the fields of intellectual culture. But at the same time, that material is so consuming that there were certain questions that weren't being asked. What was life like for the illiterate, for people who were tilling the soil, right? Because most people, that's what most people did in pre-industrial societies, or for even merchants, even people who were literate but who weren't writing like, you know, fancy long form works. And so that was kind of where this began. But any culture of documentation also has to ultimately grapple with the question of archiving, of how are these documents going to be referred to later, right? Because there has to be some kind of accountability. And what disturbed me is the discovery that, together with the assumption that, together with the observation that documents have not survived in great numbers from the medieval Middle East, came the assumption that documents had not been used. And that was kind of where I wanted to make my intervention and say, we're not looking in the right places. We shouldn't expect to have ready-made archives that we can just kind of walk into and say, okay, I'm interested in, you know, what was happening in Fustat and Cairo between 1140 and 1160. I'm going to look into this folder, because that's actually an incredibly rare situation for any historian. So we have to be more creative about where we're going to look for our sources. And that, I think, it can be intimidating, especially if you're a young scholar and you have certain kinds of deadlines you have to meet, like you need to produce books to get tenure, to get your promotions. You don't want to do that kind of really risky search where maybe you won't find anything. And so I, was fortunate that I had accumulated this sort of like pile of Arabic script documents before really knowing what I wanted to do with them. And that's when I realized, okay, I need to start talking about or thinking about archiving practices, and also what the relationship is between archives and political power in the region.
Yes, and the result of that is extremely convincing. Again, this is an extremely important question in the field. So it's really a void that your book is filling in that sense. I guess we're almost at the end of our time. Maybe I have time for a last question, which is, where will you go next now that you've written this amazing introduction, if we can say, or preface to your petitions? What's your next research project? Where will you go? Are you going back to the petitions, or in the end, did the completion of the Lost Archive took you in a completely new direction?
So I am working on the petitions book, and it's about 2/3 finished, and it's actually been quite enjoyable because so much of the research was done before. So it just feels like more of a writing project, which is really nice. But also in tandem, I'm getting very interested in the Indian Ocean trade, which is very well documented in Cairo-Geniza documents from the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. And the only reason I got interested in it is the same reason I was interested in Central Asia in the Lost Archive, is that I knew absolutely nothing about it. And I just started digging really out of curiosity. I don't know whether that will actually lead to a book project, but it's the thing I'm super excited about. Just to kind of drop one tidbit that I've discovered recently, there were Jews in Southeast Asia in the 13th century. And as soon as I found that out, I knew that this was something I was going to have to work on.
That's extremely exciting, Naina. Once again, congratulations. And I really want to thank you because you've placed the bar really high for all of us in writing this book, and that's truly inspiring. So thank you so much. Congratulations, and congratulations to Zeina as well. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about your book as well.
Thank you so much, Marie, and thank you so much to everyone who's here, Your Excellencies, Sheikh Mubarak, Ambassador Douaisan, Ambassador Guy, judges, and everyone who's listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry that there are no obvious questions in the Q&A box, but can I encourage people who, if they do have questions, to please put them there. We can always come back to Marina if necessary. And I'd like to hand over to Daniel Lowe, if I may.
Hi, everyone, and welcome this evening. Thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with Zeina. And thank you to the Society, His Excellency, the Ambassador, and to Sheikh Mubarak. And thank you to Marina and Marie for the fascinating conversation, because I think there are a lot of synergies there around kind of archives in the field. These books are very different, but actually those questions around archives and how you constitute archives and their use, I think we'll kind of see, where that goes in the course of the discussion. So I thought I'd just give a very quick introduction to Zeina's book. So Cosmopolitan Radicalism revisits the relation between visual culture and politics from global and post-colonial perspectives. Drawing on uncharted archives of everyday printed matter, it sheds light on hitherto understudied graphic design practices and modes of translocal visuality attached to print technologies. In this book, Zeina Maasri critically engages this material beyond nationally circumscribed frameworks of analysis to examine instead the mobility of modernist cultural forms, discourses and practices within the disjunctive flows of Beirut's long 1960s. Her inquiry reveals key cultural transformations that saw the city develop as a Mediterranean site of tourism and leisure, a nexus between modern art and pan-Arab publishing, and through the rise of Palestinian resistance, a node in revolutionary anti-imperialism. So I'm not sure, was Louise going to share some images? I think Zeina.
I'm going to do it, actually.
Okay,
Yeah, great.
perfect, because that was one of the comments that came up in the reviewer's sort of, description of the book, was this kind of amazing collection of images that's so useful for researchers who might not have encountered this material before. And I think around this question of archives, I mean, your book covers ephemera from the tourism industry, literary journals, artist books, book illustration, political posters, children's books. I mean, can you talk to us about how you kind of went about constituting this archive, how you used it, the media it involves, the collections you consulted, and how does this shed a different perspective and reading on the history and historiography of the Middle East and Lebanon in particular?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I'll try to share my screen in a bit, just begin to answer the question. Yeah, so this is, first of all, I'm initially trained as a graphic designer and as a visual artist before becoming a historian and interested in this material. So I was teaching practical graphic design studios, but also histories of visual culture, modern visual culture, when I was living in Lebanon. And this is where I began to sort of uncover some of the material that's actually just been completely it's like fascinating forgotten archives, just as Marina was talking about before, and that were not constituted, they were not present in one folder or one library where you go to and you find it, but just began to uncover some material specifically in my previous work on the political posters of Lebanon's civil war. And I through working on this previous project, I began to sort of trace different artists and graphic designers' connections to Beirut. They were Arab artists who were there in the 60s and 70s. Some were residents there, some just were passing through, and there were some really exciting connections that were actually being brought together during that time, mainly through people, Palestinians, Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi artists, together with Lebanese, and their collaborations with intellectuals around the time in the 60s. So they actually, the result of that were some really fascinating publishing projects, but also I was expanding the scope then to begin to think beyond the posters, which was my initial project, to look at visual culture in its everyday manifestation, even in the postcard, in different printed material that are part of modern life. So this led me to begin to work with collectors to actually put together collections of such material and begin to study it, and to use it first as a teaching resource with my students when I was at AUB. And then because there was nothing really written about this material, the project actually of writing and digging more into that and developing a deeper research into these connections and this material actually grew from there. Maybe I could actually try to show some of that.
That'd be great. Because I know, as somebody who works with library collections, looking through the book, I mean, my own collecting impulse, I keep on seeing things, and I go to our catalogue and I check, oh, do we have that? Can I get that for our collection? So it's really interesting to hear about that kind of collecting practice. So over to you with some of these.
Do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes, so this is, for instance, work that by the artist Mona Basili Sahnawi for the National Council for Tourism in Lebanon. I'll just try to go through them. Waddah Faris for the Baalbek Festival. حلمي التوني, an Egyptian graphic designer for المؤسسة العربية للدراسات والنشر, some children's book and some other books, Diya Al-Azawi. So some of these artists are known now, quite well known now, recognized and known now. Some of them, but it's their work in printed format, in how they collaborated with publishers, how they collaborated in some, in their work in magazines, in different, also for children, was something that's not, it's still something that's not written about, and we know very little about the sort of these creative collaborations that were taking shape around that time. And you can see Kamal Bulata, who's renowned now, passed away. Ismail Shammout. I'll just take you through some of these, and we can come to other questions you may have. I don't know if you want to have another question while I flip through these.
So I mean, in terms of the collecting, so we can see under the images that they're from your own collection, but you mentioned Aboudi Abu Jawda a lot. So and you mentioned him quite specifically in your acknowledgements to the book. So I was just wondering, in terms of, thinking through how often these very everyday items aren't found in institutional collections, how working with collectors like Aboudi is incredibly important to kind of shifting what are quite fixed kind of notions in kind of Middle East studies and historiography.
I mean, working with Aboudi was key because he has a brilliant collection, and we've been working together since when I was working on the Political Posters project, but with this one as well. And so that collaboration was key to build collections that I could use for this research, but also that can be developed eventually to become more accessible for other scholars and other students to use, and that's a future project. But the thing is that I think something important in the work that I've been trying to do is to be able to shed light on this material, the collaborations behind it, but also on how important it was for politics around that time, and how we might take visuality or visual culture seriously as an archival source, as archival documents that could actually give us a different perspective on the history of the period and the history of the modern history of the Middle East that has not been actually given attention to. So it's distinctive from the form of art history, or it's distinctive from other forms of cultural production. It's also to begin to think about how these archival documents could actually give us access into the cultural life and the transformations around that time, and access as visual devices. They actually they give a sense of the collective imagination around that time. So in that sense, they can be political and social, but they in the way that they had an important role in terms of activating the imagination around ideas of new ideas of leisure, new ideas of what it is to be modern, what it is to be a woman, so gender issues, what it is to be a modern woman in 1960s Lebanon or Beirut, but also ideas of emancipation and political projects, and sort of, you know, it's an access to the collective imagination around revolutionary projects as well. So the dreams and possibilities of alternative and radical futures. So in a way, it's a record of all of these that usually gets missed from some of the historiography on specifically political history of the region, that usually is written pretty much with the perspective of with the words and treaties of the political elite. So this is almost like a history of the everyday in its cultural manifestation around a very specific moment in Beirut's history, but also in the history of the region and globally, in fact.
Yes, and
some of these.
So you introduced this concept, translocal visuality. It's a kind of running analytical theme in your book, and it's probably something that, you know, a lot of people might not be familiar with, and you're kind of really introducing it into the kind of field of Middle East studies. So how do you find it's useful to understand Beirut's role as this kind of nodal city in the global 60s?
Yeah, that's important, because I mainly was trying to actually, through this material, trace how Beirut became a nodal city, in fact, in the global city. But what I mean by a nodal city is that it's a city that is a space of a cultural flow and cultural encounter, but also of conflict. And these were quite intense during the 60s and 70s, or what I would call referred to as the long 60s in Beirut, both in terms of at the level of a global scale of a Cold War taking shape at that time, but also at a regional scale of decolonization struggles and anti-colonial projects, but also regionally in the Arab world, but at the scale of the city as well, and the scale of Lebanon, to think about how it was a moment of intense political mobilization and also domestic political contestations. So these different scales were interacting and important, and in terms of thinking of the different cultural flows that were taking shape. So as you mentioned already, I was looking at Beirut's becoming, or the making of Beirut as a Mediterranean site of tourism and leisure, mainly through the state development projects in the 60s, but also how Beirut became a node of Pan-Arab publishing at the time, both for liberal sorts of publishing projects, but also radical ones. So in a way, it becomes a node for the Arab world. And the third dimension I was looking at in the area of intense cultural flows is basically how Beirut becomes, specifically after 1967, after the Arab-Israeli war and the major defeat, then Beirut becomes a major node in as a revolutionary for revolutionary anti-imperialism in the global south, mainly through the rise of the PLO and the Palestinian resistance from that space. So in all these three spaces of flow or areas of flow, I was looking at how visuality and visual culture became central, or visual culture and cultural politics actually that emerged with around this time, that sort of shaped Beirut as a nodal city in the global 60s. So the idea of translocal visuality becomes a very useful analytic lens by which I could study the movement of this actually the printed material, which is, you know, printed of images, visual culture printed in multiples being distributed, but also the movement of ideas, the movement around politics, ideas around being modern, as I mentioned before. So, and the movement of artists themselves, image makers, the images and their image and the image makers. Within the space of Beirut throughout the 60s and 70s, and how that also was crucial to shaping Beirut as a nodal city. So the translocal visuality, it's my key argument, in fact, that is one of the key sites in which we can see how Beirut was emerging as a nodal city around that time.
Really interesting, this kind of geographic circulation of images at that time, but I'm also quite interested in this kind of, you know, there's a global phenomenon of nostalgia, right? So how images circulate over time as well, and in particular in the Middle East, there's in lots of different countries, there's this kind of growing nostalgia. You know, images are circulated on social media. You kind of have this kind of film posters are really popular for, you know, decorating houses. Seen comic book artists kind of actually reproduce some of the posters from Beirut from the 50s that you include in your book. So, you know, and this is often framed as a kind of golden age, but in your book, you describe that as more of an anxious time and more of an anxious place. So I was wondering if you could talk more about, you know, this idea of nostalgia.
Yeah, I do describe it as an anxious time, and I think there is a nostalgia today, specifically after what Beirut's been going through in the past year or years now. There's a sort of attachment to that, a sort of popular myth about Beirut's golden age, like the 1960s were Beirut's golden age. And I tried to undo that in the book, and it was a difficult project, a difficult myth to undo, basically by trying to say that this was a golden age for the few and not the many. In fact, what this myth hides are the structural inequalities, both sectarian and economic, in Lebanon, and the broader conflicts that it was part of. So I think it is generally a problem. I talk about it in another piece I wrote about how we go beneath the vintage skin of some of this material today, some of this circulation of images today. It is a problem if we keep on referring to the idea of a golden age of Lebanon in the 60s that would be punctuated by civil wars. So the 58 on one side, 1958, or 1975 on the other side. And I'm trying to say that it is a problem to think that as if these civil wars were alien to the society, but it's actually was living its golden age. If we just uncover that myth, we discover some of the problems, some of the moments of grievance, of uprisings in 58 and 10 years later in 68, 69, which led to the civil war. Moments of protests and domestic grievances in which people actually, there were uprisings. But when we just write a history as if it was, or think of it, or of the golden age and just histories of civil wars, then we're forgetting that there's also a history of people's protests that's being erased with that. The wars were in fact a consequence, if not a symptom of also precisely that that golden age was a golden age for the few.
And just in the few minutes we have left, I was just wondering, sort of beyond academia, beyond Middle East studies, beyond kind of art history, the history of design, you know, who do you want to read your book? Are there, you know, other demographics who you think, you know, should be reading your book? And I'm really interested in what you were saying about the sort of the aesthetics of that period and unrest and protest, because we see at the moment, you know, in a lot of kind of protest movements from the region that, you know, art, design and aesthetics is huge in terms of how they communicate their message. So I was just wondering in terms of, you know, who you want to access for this material, and then maybe sort of on the back of that speak about future projects that you have to make that material potentially more accessible.
Yeah, that's an important question, Daniel. So yes, I think beyond the academic, and I'm really pleased that the reviewers and jurors found the book accessible, because it's important that it would be accessible to a generation that has been disconnected from that history, and a generation that has its own grievances today, that lives in conflict, that also has had or still has its own hopes for change, right? So I think in a way it's important that they have an access to previous moments of such uprisings, to learn from that, but to also to build from that. In a way, there is also a history gives us a sense of hope, if I may end there, with the idea that there is in looking at the visual culture of that time, but also of today in the streets of Beirut, whether it takes on the form of digital media, there is an aesthetics of hope in this, and I think that's again something that we need to capture as we write the histories of this part of the world. Where am I going with this? I think one key thing is to be able to make it more accessible through digitization projects, through exhibitions that will make it available, make some of this material available, and draw attention to it to a wide audience, to work with people with whom actually this constitutes an important cultural heritage, but as well with creative practitioners today who will also find this previous generations' work very inspiring, and they might have actually been disconnected from. So yeah, that's where I'm hoping to build from.
Well, I just want, from a personal perspective, I want to thank you, Zeina, for the book, because in terms of my work in kind of libraries and archives, it's become an essential reference for me. I mean, as you said, like a lot of these books and sort of printed ephemera that you refer to isn't referred to in any other kind of academic writing. So to actually have something to refer to now is really incredibly useful. So thank you so much. And I'm just wondering, seeing if we have any questions. I can't see any in the Q&A box, but if any of the people on the panel have any questions, feel free to ask. And if not, we can wrap up there, and I'll hand back to you.
If I may just thank everyone who's been involved in this prize. I'm really honored and overjoyed, in fact, to actually receive, for the recognition that this prize gives to not just to my work, but basically to actually perhaps take more seriously in academic work the visual culture and its intersection with politics.
Thank you, Zeina.
Scholarship.
What could be more important than the aesthetics of hope? I just want to say thank you for, I actually think that the fact that we're on Zoom, even though we have maybe not quite reached out to as many people as we had hoped, the fact that you're able to share those images online maybe take out the book and relook at them again, because they were about the aesthetics of hope. It is that joy just looking at and knowing that they were written in such traumatic times, and maybe, yes, the hope that such beauty in art will also come out of the current crisis in Beirut. Apologies for being emotional about that. Thank you, Marina, as well, and thank you for Daniel for joining the ideas of archives and different types of archives. That was very clever. So there was a theme, even though we maybe didn't quite think of it like that. I hope that we can see you all next year in the Mansion House. Thank you, Sheikh Mubarak, for mentioning that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If I can just give a final word to thank, please, Ambassador Francis, all the participants, the winners, Mr. Lowy, Mrs. Professor Rousseau, of course, our judges who I mentioned, and last but not least, the Ambassador. But we have always, they say, the soldier at the back who, does everything for us. And I must thank her the most. It was, of course, is Louise for coordinating everything and for arranging everything over the years. And if I can give a round of applause to her, please, for that, and to thank her for, making this happen, because she's the one behind everything, organizing everything and keeping us, up to par. So I'd like to thank her for that always.
Thank you indeed. And have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you, Louise.
Congratulations, Marina, as well. Thank you.
Yes, you too. I can't wait to read your book.